the topic that's been given to me today is 2611, revisiting 2611. So when we talk about the 2611 attacks, we as Indians, we are aware of a lot of facts. We are aware that these attacks happened over a period of 3 days, beg your pardon, and we had about 170 people dead. The attackers came from Pakistan. Initially, we were not sure about who the attackers were, but with the capture of one terrorist, we realized the whole conspiracy. And these are some of the facts that we know today. But when we have to revisit 2611 and try to understand what was the problem with the event that day, what really challenged our security forces, what were some of the policy challenges that we faced, it's my understanding that we'll have to look at 4 specific dilemmas that the Indian government at that point in time faced. So from an analytical point of view, the first dilemma that I would like to present is that of a terrorist operation versus a special forces or a commando operation. All right. So when we talk about a terrorist operation, we as academicians, right, we find it very easy to define what terrorism is. Or even though it is a hotly contested topic, we do have a certain sense of understanding that terrorism is the use of violent force against non-combatants, in order to achieve a political goal. But then when we look at the 2611 attacks, right, it's slightly offbeat in the sense that I know when I make this statement, a lot of people, especially from the military, the ones who served in the special forces, tend to be annoyed with this sort of an analysis. But nevertheless, it does help us in terms of understanding the event better. It is good for us to look at the 2611 attacks from the point of view of a special forces operation. All right. So when we ask ourselves what makes a special forces operation, we know that these operations are meant to be simple in a limited time frame. It has a command and control network. There are good intelligence, support for these kind of operations, and they happen for a very specific purpose. Every operation has a very specific outcome, a policy goal that they would like to achieve. Now, when we read the Pradhan Committee report, right, the report uses the word act of war numerous times. But when we ask ourselves, what was this act of war that Pakistan actually carried out against India? There we will need to look at this not as simply a terrorist attack, but as a commando raid that happened from Pakistan with real-time intelligence and real-time command and control that happened from Lahore or Karachi, and with their operatives carrying out these attacks in different parts of Mumbai. All right, so that is the first dilemma. When we are looking at the event, do we look at it as a terrorist attack, a standalone terrorist attack, or do we look at it as part of a commando operation conducted by Pakistan, who was by Pakistani ISI, who were in courts with some of the rogue elements from the LET. The second dilemma that we faced is that of state sponsorship versus domestic radicalization. Now, we've had the previous 3 speakers speak about Islamic terrorism, Islamic extremism, Islamic terrorism at great lengths. But when you look at the 2611 attacks, right when the attack happened, the first organization to claim responsibility for this attack was a group called Deccan Mujahideen. The group never really existed in the first place, right? We haven't heard of the group after the attack, nor had any analyst that I know of had heard of this group before the attack. So what really happened at that point in time? For this, we will have to go back to early 1992. If we have to understand what really went right or went wrong at that point in time. So in the year 1992, the Indian intelligence intercepted, they caught hold of a man called Manjit Singh, and through him, we learned about a grand plan hatched by the Pakistani ISI, which is called Plan K2M. Right. So what we learned at that point in time was that the Pakistanis at that point in time were trying to combine the militancy that was happening in Punjab with that of Kashmir militancy, and then link it to pan-Islamist jihad that was happening in the rest of India. And the first outcome of it was the 1993 Mumbai blast that we saw. Right. From there, the Indian intelligence and the Indian security forces realized that state sponsorship of terror in India is sort of growing. It is going to be a massive threat to India's national security. But then we faced a different problem in the coming years. It started off with attacks in Coimbatore and post the Godhra riots in Gujarat and so on. We saw a narrative that was built, and with some bit of evidence as well, that domestic jihadism or domestic terrorism, domestic radicalization is on the rise, right? And this was also something that our own politicians gave a lot of fuel to, as the previous speakers have also mentioned. And as a consequence, what happened was, even close to the 2611 attacks, while India had suffered, especially the city of Mumbai had suffered numerous terrorist attacks, we were not really sure who were carrying out these attacks, right? Even when the 2611 attack had happened, the perception among several analysts in India was that this was carried out by radical Indian Muslims, or for some of them it was extremist Hindu groups, right? But nobody actually suspected that it could have been Pakistan, which was the actual perpetrator of this attack. we needed hardcore evidence that came in the form of communications intercept and so on to actually prove that it was Pakistan that was part of this. So we see in these interim years a sort of a narrative that had emerged from the highest office of the countries, from somebody like Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, saying that a stable Pakistan is in India's best interest, or somebody said that Islamic terrorism is a mutual threat for both India and Pakistan that has to be fought. So there was a sort of discrepancy in our understanding of what state sponsor of terrorism was, and so that essentially becomes the second dilemma that we face, that of whether it was a state sponsored terrorism or is it domestic radicalization. So once these two dilemmas were sort of taken care of, right? One is whether it was a terrorist operation or a special forces operation, and the second dilemma being whether it was state sponsorship or domestic radicalization. Then we did encounter the third major dilemma, which came in terms of our own counter-terrorist response. That is, what could be regarded as diplomatic success was not essentially a counter-terrorist success. That is the dilemma of diplomatic success and counter-terrorist failure, right? What I mean by this is, the traditional response of India when it comes to counterterrorism was to use Indian diplomats to expose Pakistan as much as possible, right? We went around the globe giving, especially the Americans and the British, as much evidence as possible of Pakistan's knavery in India, their adventurism in India. We gave them forensic evidence. We gave them a lot of evidences. But what this essentially did, when we look back in hindsight, is that it did expose Pakistan, but not in a manner that we wanted them to be exposed, right? What happened was the Western nations started to realize that Pakistan was indeed sponsoring terrorism, but this was a state, a nuclear powered state, which was on the verge of failure. And it became the responsibility of the Western states to protect it from failure, if not the fear that these groups would then start to attack Western interests, right? So to put it simply, what we thought would be a good strategy in terms of exposing Pakistan in order to curb our own problems, it backfired because overexposure of Pakistan made them more immune to Western pressure, because the Western nations started to believe that Pakistan is this little brother with nuclear weapons who has to be whose demands have to be catered to, whereas India is this big brother with which is a responsible nuclear state who can always be asked to exercise restraint. So that was the third dilemma, where diplomatically we were successful in terms of exposing Pakistan as well as possible. But when it came to actual counter-terrorist impact of such kind of an exposure, it did not really match our expectations. So that is the third dilemma that I would like to point out. And coming to the final and the fourth dilemma, which sort of flows from the third dilemma, it is that of international consensus versus national interest, right? When we look at global terrorism, at least since the year 2001, we see that there has been a massive consensus, at least among the Western nations, that they are here to fight terrorist groups, right? And that's why they had this whole thing called global war on terror. But very soon we realized that there was this, what do you call it? A sort of a misperception game that is coming in, where the Westerners got into this narrative even before realizing that there was something known as my terrorist versus your terrorist. Right? Okay, so that was something that India wasn't ready for. All right, so we see this happening. For example, when we look at the 26/11 attacks itself, we see this happening immediately after the attacks. The moment the attacks happened, what did India have to do? India had to firstly produce evidence and dossiers to show that this was an attack coming out of Pakistan. We did it by submitting dossiers, which included the communications intelligence intercepts that we had taken during those 3 days. But despite all of it, what really happened in the immediate aftermath of the attacks? We had somebody like David Miliband, who was the British Foreign Secretary, who came to India, and he said that these attacks were a consequence of the Kashmir problem, right? Now, we couldn't have expected the British to act against India's interest, to put it more mildly, because this is clearly an act of terror that the Pakistanis had conducted simply because they realized that the Lashkar-e-Taiba, there were rifts within the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and they wanted to export terror elsewhere. And they also wanted to prove a point to the global Islamist movement that was happening in the form of Al-Qaeda, that they could also pull off an attack that is on a grand scale as that of 9/11, right? But all of these facts were brushed aside, and what the British tried to do was they tried to equate India and Pakistan together and said that the Kashmir problem had to be resolved. Only then would this problem of terrorism be resolved. So that is the limits of what we could expect from the Westerners as far as support in counterterrorism was concerned. Similarly, even when it came to the interrogation of these suspects, right? We had caught Ajmal Kasab was caught by I mean, today we are sitting here and we are also remembering one of our greatest heroes of the Indian Army, General Rawat. I think it's also time we remember Constable Tukaram Omble, who's surrendered his life in return, in order to capture this terrorist who had come to die. So it would have changed the entire narrative had he not been caught, right? And then what did we do? We immediately allowed the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States to investigate, to interrogate Kasab, right? And similarly, when we caught Zabiuddin Ansari in Saudi Arabia and extradited him, we did share those reports as well with the United States. But it took the next 2 years for the United States to allow us to have even a brief interrogation of David Headley, or Daud Gilani, whatever name you'd like to prefer, right? So this shows that there are serious limits to how much we can expect the Western nations to help us in terms of counterterrorism, because for them, their own national interest becomes very important. And this is something that was told to me directly by an American official back in 2015, which was about 8 or 9 years after the attack, where he told me candidly that, so long as Lashkar-e-Taiba does not affect Western interests, there is no reason for us to go hard on it, right? So this is as candid an observation that a Westerner could have done. But despite that, I think that the Indians tend to invest a lot of diplomatic capital in terms of fighting terrorism rather than other kinetic means. So as a whole, when we look at 26/11, just not the event of 26/11, but from the time the Plan K2M was hatched in Pakistan until today, what is that? What do we learn from Pakistan? We learn that they have got two things correct, right? The first thing is they've very clearly understood the limits of Western intolerance of their, adventurism, right? They've very clearly understood that whatever they do, especially when they do it in India or Afghanistan, and so long as they don't affect the Western interest, right, they know that they just have to keep quiet for some time, right? Let me give you another example for this. If you go back to 2001, after the attacks on the parliament, right, after that we launched Operation Parakram. Immediately the American government came quite heavy on Pakistan, asking them to, stop whatever they're doing. It only meant that you have to, now whatever court operations Pakistan was conducting against India, it had to be mellowed down a little bit so as to not gain such a grand exposure, right? That is the kind of double games the Western nations have been playing, and that is something that the Pakistanis have very clearly understood. That whenever there's an attack or something that happens, they have to spend about maximum of 6 weeks before the Western pressure reduces, and then they can continue whatever they're doing again. This we see repeatedly happening since the 1980s at least, if not later. So, and then the second thing that they've got it right is the scale of Indian tolerance. I mean, it would be wrong for me to say this today, but at least until 2013, 2014, the Pakistanis couldn't have been any wrong when they knew that, when they realized or when they assessed that Indians had a great resilience power. They would never retaliate hardly to any sort of attacks that came out of Pakistan. But this was proved wrong by subsequent events, as we have seen with our own surgical strikes and the Balakot strike that happened. At least we made a statement that our tolerance levels are no more to be taken for granted. But so far as the 26/11 incident was concerned, it was an outcome of these two assessments made by the Pakistani ISI. One, that the Western intolerance has its own limits; they're not going to go overboard, and the Indian tolerance has no limits; they're going to be tolerant forever. And that was something that even subsequent Indian reaction to. I mean, I think recently we've had Manish Tiwari also write a book, and where he mentions about. He was also critical about India's response to the 26/11 attacks, where a lack of retaliation from India is not exactly how you counter terrorism, right? And from my own interactions with the Western scholars, the Western analysts, what I've learned is that they're also in favor of quick retaliation. Maybe yes, there is a strong Pakistani lobby in Britain, United States, and places who would really press the governments hard to ensure that they apply some sort of pressure on India to exercise restraint. But still, if not in the form of a massive mobilization or something, in terms of quick court actions or any sort of quick retaliatory action, I think the Westerners are also happy with it. So when we look back at the 26/11 attacks, I think that these are some of the points that we need to remember. There are serious limitations to our own analysis when we look at it as a standalone terrorist attack and not as a special operations conducted by the Pakistani ISI. And there are also limitations when we exaggerate our own domestic communal disputes, which is a serious threat, especially given that the nature of Indian democracy is quite flawed, like any other third world democracy. I think our politicians need to stop pandering to these communal extremities and maintain a narrative that really works very well in India's national security. And the third point is that we have to understand the limits of diplomacy when it comes to countering terrorism, and need to take into consideration other means and other instruments of countering terror, like that of the military and special forces, as well as the intelligence agencies. And finally, we need to take into consideration that we shouldn't take Pakistan's assessment of the global geopolitics quite lightly, because it seems to always tend to favor them. So we must be capable of drawing our own red lines, very clearly, and letting them know what could be crossed and what could not be. And this is also something that needs to be communicated to the international community as clearly as possible. So with these few comments, I'd like to end my talk here, and I look forward to any questions if there are. Thank you.